Snow covered the quiet town like a soft white blanket. The air outside was still, only the wind whispering through the tall pine trees that surrounded Margaret's cabin. Inside, the warmth of a crackling fire filled the small living room. The orange light danced across the old wooden walls, touching the family photos that hung in simple frames. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, wrapped in a wool blanket, her silver hair glowing faintly in the light. It had been a long, quiet day. Her grandson Ethan had arrived earlier that afternoon. He said he needed to get away from things for a while. She hadn't asked what things. Margaret had learned over the years that sometimes silence helped people speak more than questions did. Ethan was 22 now, tall, with gentle eyes that reminded her of his late grandfather. But tonight, those eyes carried something else, a quiet heaviness. As if a storm was brewing behind them, he sat across from her, close to the fire, staring into the flames without saying a word. The only sounds were the firewood popping softly and the wind brushing against the windows. Margaret studied him carefully. He hadn't eaten much at dinner, and he'd been avoiding eye contact. Something was clearly on his mind. After a while, she poured him a cup of cocoa, just the way he liked, with extra marshmallows. She handed it to him and smiled gently. "You've been quiet all evening, Ethan," she said softly. "That's not like you." He looked up briefly and forced a small smile. "I guess I've just got a lot on my mind, Grandma." Margaret nodded slowly. "Sometimes that happens. But you know, the mind doesn't get lighter by holding everything inside." Ethan chuckled faintly but didn't answer right away. He took a sip of cocoa, his hands wrapped tightly around the mug. His silence was louder than any words could be. Margaret waited, patient as always. She had seen that same look many years ago, the look of someone who wanted to speak but didn't know how. Finally, he said quietly, "Grandma, can I tell you something? It's kind of personal." Margaret leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Of course you can, dear. You can tell me anything." He hesitated again, his eyes fixed on the flames. "It's just, I've been seeing someone special." Margaret smiled warmly. "That's wonderful, Ethan. Love is a beautiful thing." He looked down, his expression unsure. "It's not that simple. She's older than me. A lot older." For a moment, the room went silent. The fire crackled softly between them. Margaret didn't react. Not with shock, not with judgment. She just watched him carefully. "How much older?" she asked, her tone calm. Ethan's voice was almost a whisper. "Almost 20 years." Margaret leaned back in her chair, the light from the fire flickering across her thoughtful face. She didn't look angry or disappointed. Instead, she looked curious, as if trying to understand. "And how do you feel about her?" she asked. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes soft but filled with confusion. "She's amazing. She listens to me. She understands me like no one else does. I feel peaceful when I'm around her, but also scared. Scared that people won't understand." Margaret nodded slowly. She remembered that feeling, the fear of being judged for following your heart. She had lived long enough to know that love rarely followed rules. Love doesn't always come when people expect it to. She said quietly, "And it doesn't always look the way others think it should. But that doesn't make it wrong." Ethan's shoulders relaxed a little. "So, you don't think I'm crazy?" Margaret smiled. "No, dear. The world may have its opinions, but the heart doesn't care about numbers. It cares about connection, about truth. The real question is whether what you feel is real, something that lasts beyond the excitement." Ethan nodded, staring into the fire. "It feels real, Grandma. She's been through so much, and somehow she still has this warmth. When I'm with her, I feel like I can finally breathe." Margaret's heart softened. She could see that this wasn't a passing thing for him. He wasn't just infatuated. He was truly touched by this woman's presence in his life. "Well then," she said gently, "you must follow your heart, but do it with wisdom. Love is not just about feeling good, Ethan. It's about being honest, kind, and brave enough to do what's right even when it's difficult." Ethan exhaled slowly. as if letting go of a burden he had been carrying for months. "Thank you, Grandma. I was scared you'd be disappointed." Margaret chuckled softly. "At my age, I've seen too much to be shocked by love. The world changes, but the heart stays the same. What matters is the goodness you bring into it." For the first time that night, Ethan smiled. Not a forced one, but a real, gentle smile. The firelight flickered across his face, making him look like the little boy she used to read bedtime stories to. They sat in silence for a while longer, both lost in thought. Margaret watched the flames and thought about her own past, the loves she'd lost, the choices she'd made, and the dreams she'd once carried. Ethan reminded her of herself years ago, full of hope and fear all at once. The clock ticked softly on the wall. The snow outside began to slow, and the world felt still. It was one of those rare moments when time seemed to pause, holding two souls in a shared understanding. Finally, Ethan spoke again. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Did you ever love someone you weren't supposed to?" Margaret froze for a second, her eyes fixed on the fire. The question hit a place deep inside her, a memory she hadn't touched in years. She felt a slow ache in her chest, but forced a gentle smile. "Yes," she said quietly, "a long time ago." "What happened?" he asked softly. She looked at him, her eyes glimmering with something unspoken. "That's a story for another night." Ethan nodded, sensing her hesitation. The air between them carried something heavy yet beautiful, a connection deeper than words. As the fire dimmed, Margaret stood up and placed another log on it. The flames rose again, lighting up her calm, thoughtful face. She turned to Ethan and said softly, "Go get some rest, dear. The night is long and hearts need peace to heal." Ethan stood, gave her a warm hug, and whispered, "Good night, Grandma." When he went upstairs, Margaret sat back down, staring at the flickering flames. She felt something stir in her, not just for Ethan's story, but for the ghost of her own past. Somewhere in that firelight, she saw the reflection of the young woman she once was, standing in the same place, holding on to a love she never dared to keep. The clock ticked on. The snow outside stopped completely. And in that silence, Margaret whispered softly to herself, "Love always finds its way, even when the world doesn't understand." She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and closed her eyes, the firelight painting soft shadows across her peaceful face. The next morning arrived quietly. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world outside still and white. Margaret stood by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Watching the first rays of sunlight shimmer across the frozen fields, she could still hear Ethan's words from the night before echoing in her mind. "She's older than me, but she understands me." There had been truth in his voice, something that made her both proud and uneasy. Ethan came downstairs, looking a little more rested, but still distant. He smiled softly. "Morning, Grandma." "Morning, sweetheart." Margaret replied with a gentle tone. "Breakfast is ready, eggs, toast, and some of that raspberry jam you like," he chuckled. "You never forget." They sat together at the wooden table. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. For a while they talked about simple things, the weather, his work, the old neighbors she still wrote to. But beneath the light conversation, Margaret could feel there was more he wanted to say. His eyes kept drifting as if he was trapped between courage and hesitation. When breakfast ended, Margaret began tidying up. Ethan hesitated, then said quietly, "Grandma, do you remember when I used to write stories when I was a kid?" She smiled. "Of course I do. You used to fill entire notebooks with your little adventures." "Why?" He took a deep breath and reached into his jacket pocket. "I wrote something again. But this time it's not fiction." He pulled out a folded letter, slightly wrinkled at the corners, and placed it on the table. "I wasn't sure if I should show you this, but I think you'll understand." Margaret looked at the letter, then back at him. "Is this about her?" He nodded silently. For a moment she hesitated, then unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was neat but nervous. As she began to read, her heart softened. The letter wasn't long, but every word was honest, filled with quiet emotion and uncertainty. Ethan wrote about how he met her, Rachel, a woman who worked at the local library. She had helped him find books when he was struggling through a difficult period of his life. Over time, their conversations turned from literature to life, from pages to feelings. He described her kindness, the way she made him feel seen, how her wisdom gave him peace. But he also wrote about his fear, how people would never accept their connection, how he worried about being misunderstood. When Margaret finished reading, she placed the letter down gently. Ethan was watching her, waiting for her reaction, his hands clenched on the table. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Every word feels true." He looked relieved, but still uncertain. "Do you really think so? It doesn't sound foolish." Margaret shook her head. "No, Ethan, it sounds human. You've written about love, the kind that doesn't shout but speaks quietly through understanding. That's rare." Ethan smiled weakly. "I wanted you to know because you've always been honest with me. I didn't want to hide it from you." Margaret nodded. "I appreciate that. But Ethan, love, especially one that's unusual, can be hard. You'll have to be stronger than most." "I know," he whispered. "But I can't stop thinking about her. It's like she changed how I see everything." Margaret looked out the window for a long moment, her thoughts wandering far away. "Love has a way of doing that," she said softly. "When I was younger, I once met someone like that. He wasn't someone I could be with, but for a time, he made me feel alive again." Ethan looked up, surprised. "Really? You never told me?" Margaret smiled faintly. Some stories stay hidden until the right moment. Ethan leaned forward. "What happened?" She looked at him, her expression tender but wistful. "We were both married to life in different ways. He was a traveler, a man who came to fix the town's old clock tower. He had a gentle spirit, but his heart belonged to the road. We shared quiet moments, nothing more. But in those days, I remembered what it felt like to be truly seen. Then one day, he left. No goodbyes, no promises. Just silence and memory." Ethan listened, his eyes filled with both sadness and understanding. "Did you ever hear from him again?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but sometimes love isn't meant to stay. It's meant to teach." The words hung in the air like a truth neither of them could ignore. Ethan looked down at his letter again. "I think I understand that now." For a while, neither of them spoke. The wind outside picked up, brushing softly against the window pane. Margaret could feel the ache of time in her chest, the way life's moments slip through the fingers no matter how tightly you tried to hold them. Finally, she stood up and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You're a good man, Ethan. Whatever happens, don't let the world make you ashamed of what you feel. Just make sure your love brings kindness, not confusion. That's how you'll know it's real." Ethan looked up, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I'll remember that, Grandma." She smiled warmly. "Good. Now go take a walk. Clear your head. The snow's beautiful this morning." He nodded and stood, slipping on his coat. As he opened the door, a gust of cold air swept in, carrying the scent of pine and frost. "I'll be back in a bit," he said. When the door closed behind him, Margaret looked back at the letter still lying on the table. She picked it up again and read it once more, slower this time. Something about his words, his honesty, his innocence touched her deeply. It reminded her that love, no matter how complicated, was always worth understanding. She folded the letter neatly and placed it inside one of her old photo albums, next to a faded picture of herself as a young woman. On the back of the photo was a note she had written decades ago. "Love doesn't fade. It changes shape." Margaret smiled softly. She whispered to the empty room, "He's going to be fine. He just needs to find his own way." Hours later, Ethan returned, his cheeks red from the cold. He seemed lighter, as if his walk had cleared more than just his thoughts. "You were right, Grandma," he said, smiling. "The snow's peaceful. It makes everything feel possible." Margaret looked at him with quiet pride. "That's how it should be, dear. Life is full of storms, but sometimes peace comes in the middle of them." As the day faded into evening, the fire crackled again, and the two of them sat side by side. Ethan read from one of the books Rachel had recommended, and Margaret listened quietly, her eyes full of warmth. The world outside was frozen, but inside, there was only calm, the calm that comes from love, understanding, and the courage to be true to oneself. The next afternoon, the wind howled over the small countryside house as snowflakes danced across the porch. Margaret was knitting near the fire when she heard the crunch of tires on the icy driveway. It was rare for anyone to visit her unannounced, so when she saw a car pull up, curiosity replaced her calm. Ethan, who was helping her bring in wood, looked out the window and frowned. "That's Rachel's car," he said softly. Margaret's knitting needles paused midair. "Rachel?" Ethan nodded, his face tightening with surprise and nerves. Before either of them could say another word, there was a gentle knock at the door. Margaret gave him a reassuring nod. "Go on," she whispered. "Open it." Ethan hesitated, then turned the knob. Standing there was a woman bundled in a long gray coat, her auburn hair streaked with silver, her expression kind but anxious. Her eyes, soft, intelligent, and deeply human, met Ethan's immediately. "Rachel?" he said quietly, breath visible in the cold air. "Hi," she replied, her voice calm but uncertain. "I didn't mean to show up like this. I needed to talk." Margaret stood, smoothing her shawl, and approached with a welcoming smile. "Come in, dear. It's freezing out there." Rachel stepped inside, shaking the snow off her coat. The warmth of the fireplace softened her tension a little. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "Not at all," Margaret replied. "Any friend of Ethan's is welcome here." They all sat around the fire. Ethan seemed both grateful and nervous. Margaret could sense the unspoken emotions swirling between them: affection, confusion, and something deeper. Rachel spoke first. "Ethan told you." "Yes," Margaret said gently. "He showed me your letter. You've been important to him." Rachel looked down at her hands. "He's been important to me too. More than I expected." Itzan looked between them, unsure how to react. "Rachel, I didn't know you'd come." "I thought I know," she interrupted softly. "But after last night, I couldn't stop thinking. You've been so honest with me, and I needed to be honest with myself." Margaret watched the two carefully. There was no discomfort in Rachel's demeanor, just sincerity. Rachel looked like someone who had lived through years of responsibility, who had known both love and loss. It was clear that what she felt wasn't impulsive. It was something that had quietly grown. "I wasn't sure if I should see you again," Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. "People talk, and I've lived long enough to know how cruel gossip can be. But when I think about you, Ethan, I don't feel doubt. I feel peace." Ethan's expression softened. "That's how I feel too." Margaret leaned back, her eyes thoughtful. "You two remind me of something I once heard, that real connection isn't about age or circumstance. It's about timing and truth." Rachel smiled faintly. "That sounds like something I'd tell one of my library visitors." They all laughed quietly, easing the tension in the room. After a while, Margaret excused herself to make tea. As the kettle began to hum, she could hear their low voices from the living room, gentle, careful, and full of emotion. Ethan was speaking about his struggles, about how the world always expected him to be strong and sure, but how he often felt lost. Rachel listened, never interrupting, her calm presence grounding him. When Margaret returned with the tea tray, she noticed something: the way Rachel looked at Ethan, not like a woman protecting a secret, but like someone who finally allowed herself to care. They drank tea quietly, the fire crackling softly. Then Rachel turned to Margaret. "I know this might be difficult for you to accept. The age difference. The way this might look from the outside." Margaret interrupted with a kind smile. "My dear, I've lived long enough to learn that love doesn't fit neatly into what people expect. What matters is whether it brings kindness into your life. That's the only test worth trusting." Rachel's eyes glistened. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Ethan reached for her hand briefly, a quiet, respectful gesture. Margaret noticed but didn't comment. She just smiled inwardly, not because it was easy, but because she could see that what they shared was real. As the evening deepened, the storm outside grew harsher. Rachel decided to leave before the snow piled too high. Ethan insisted on walking her to her car. Margaret stood at the window watching them through the frost-covered glass. She saw how Rachel touched Ethan's arm gently, how they spoke softly before saying goodbye. There was no kiss, no dramatic gesture, just warmth and respect. When Ethan came back inside, there was a quiet glow in his face, like he had finally found clarity. "She's going to visit her sister for a few days," he said, "but she said she'll call me when she's back." Margaret nodded. "That's good. Give her space and let it grow naturally. Don't rush what's already special." Ethan smiled. "You always know what to say?" That night, long after Ethan had gone to bed, Margaret sat by the fire again. She stared at the flames, thinking about her own life, about the chances she hadn't taken and the ones she had. She wasn't sad, just thoughtful. She realized something then. Love never truly leaves you. It just changes form, passing through generations, teaching each heart something new. The next morning, the sky was clear again. The world outside sparkled with sunlight reflecting off the snow. Ethan helped her shovel the driveway, laughing when he slipped. And Margaret joined in his laughter, something she hadn't done in a long time, as they worked. Ethan said, "Grandma, you know what I realized last night? Sometimes the people who come into your life later aren't there to change it completely. They're there to remind you who you really are." Margaret nodded. "That's true. And sometimes they remind you what it means to care again." Ethan smiled, glancing toward the horizon where Rachel had driven away. "I think that's what she did." When they went back inside, Margaret handed him the same photo album she'd tucked his letter into. "Keep this," she said softly. "There's a note in there from when I was your age. I think you'll understand it better now." He flipped through the pages until he found the old photo of her younger self, standing beside the clock tower. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, "Love doesn't fade. It changes shape." Ethan looked at her, his eyes bright. "You really believe that?" She smiled. "With all my heart." The fire popped softly in the hearth as they sat together, the warmth surrounding them both. Margaret knew that life wasn't done teaching her yet, and neither was love. She didn't need to approve or disapprove of Ethan's choices. All she needed was to understand, to keep her heart open, and to trust that love in all its unexpected forms would find its way. Days passed quietly after Rachel's visit. Winter deepened, blanketing the little town in stillness. Margaret's house sat on the edge of a hill, overlooking fields that glimmered under the morning frost. Inside, warmth filled the air, not just from the fire, but from the sense of peace that had settled between her and Ethan. The tension that once lingered had faded, replaced by something more meaningful. Understanding that Ethan had grown quieter, not from sadness, but reflection. He spent more time helping his grandmother with small things, fixing the old fence, organizing the attic, cooking dinner together. Margaret watched him carefully. She could see how Rachel's presence had changed him. He seemed steadier, more sure of himself. There was still uncertainty about what lay ahead, but his heart had found direction. One evening, after dinner, the wind picked up outside again. Snow swirled against the windows. Ethan added more wood to the fireplace and turned to his grandmother with a soft smile. "You know," he said, "I never told you what Rachel said before she left that night." Margaret looked up from her knitting. "What did she say?" "She said," he began, his voice quiet, "that sometimes love comes not to stay forever, but to remind us what it feels like to be seen." Margaret nodded slowly, her heart tightening with emotion. "That's a beautiful thing to say. And she's right." Ethan sat down across from her, the firelight flickering between them. "I don't know what'll happen next. Maybe she'll come back, maybe she won't, but I think I needed her to show me how to stop hiding from life." Margaret smiled. "That's the gift people like her leave behind. The courage to keep living." The clock ticked softly on the mantel. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled only with the sound of crackling wood and the soft hum of the wind outside. Then Margaret stood, walked to a small cabinet, and took out a wooden box. It was old, polished, smooth by time. She handed it to Ethan. "This belonged to your grandfather," she said. "He gave it to me on our 10th anniversary. I haven't opened it in years." Ethan looked at her, curious. "Why give it to me now?" "Because it's your turn," she said gently. "To understand what love really means. Not the easy kind, but the kind that lasts through silence, distance, and change." Ethan opened the box carefully. Inside was a faded photograph of Margaret and her late husband, Thomas, standing near a lake. They looked young, full of laughter. Beside it was a letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the words were still clear. He began to read aloud. "My dear Margaret, if you're reading this, it means we've reached another winter together. I hope the fire is warm and the coffee strong. I hope you still laugh the way you do when the snow first falls. If life ever feels lonely, remember this: love doesn't fade. It echoes. Sometimes softly, sometimes far away, but it never truly leaves us." Ethan's voice faltered, and he looked up. Margaret's eyes glistened, reflecting the light of the fire. "He wrote that the winter before he passed," she said softly. "I never shared it with anyone. But I think it's time." Ethan folded the letter carefully, holding it as if it were made of glass. "He sounds like the kind of man who never stopped loving you." She smiled faintly. "He never did. And I never stopped loving him. But love changes shape. It moves forward through us, through the people we care about." That's what he meant. There was a deep silence between them, the kind that didn't feel heavy, but full, sacred in its quiet understanding. The fire burned lower, and the shadows stretched long across the wooden floor. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You know, Grandma, sometimes I think about how small moments change everything. Sitting by this fire with you, reading this letter, it feels like I'm learning something I should have known all along." Margaret's eyes softened. "That's what family does, Ethan. We pass on more than names and stories. We pass on the way we love." The wind outside began to calm. Snow still fell, but gently now, flakes drifting like whispers from the sky. Margaret stood and placed another log on the fire. The orange glow filled the room, painting their faces in warmth. Then, unexpectedly, there was a soft knock at the door. They exchanged a look. Ethan stood, his heart suddenly racing. When he opened the door, cold air rushed in, and there she was. Rachel, her cheeks were flushed from the wind, her scarf dusted with snow. "I hope I'm not too late," she said, her voice trembling with both nerves and relief. Ethan blinked in disbelief. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" "I was driving home from my sister's," she said, "and something told me to stop by. I didn't want to let things end in uncertainty." Margaret smiled gently from where she stood. "Then come in, dear. You're just in time for the firelight." Rachel stepped inside, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "I thought about what you said, about not running from what feels real, and I decided, maybe life's too short for hesitation." Ethan took a breath, his heart full. "I'm glad you did." Margaret quietly returned to her chair, letting them talk. The two sat near the fireplace again, the same place where their story had truly begun. But now the air between them wasn't filled with confusion or tension. It was something softer, calm, honest, and deeply human. Rachel looked into the fire. "When I left that night, I told myself I was protecting both of us. But I think I was just afraid of being happy again." Ethan reached over, his voice steady. "Then maybe we can stop being afraid together." Margaret listened without interrupting. There was nothing more she needed to say. She could feel her late husband's words in her heart. Love doesn't fade. It echoes. And tonight, she could hear that echo in the laughter and warmth of the two people beside her. The night grew still. Outside, the stars blinked faintly above the snowy fields. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. Margaret leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling the peace of knowing that love in all its unexpected forms had found its way back into her home. When she opened her eyes again, Ethan and Rachel were still talking quietly, their faces lit by the last golden flickers of flame. Margaret smiled. The firelight was dimming, but the warmth remained alive, steady. An endless dot. As the clock struck midnight, she whispered to herself, "Yes, Thomas. Love truly echoes.